this is one of those heavy detail chapters. It's almost the last. We've been through most of the heavy detail chapters already. The only other one besides this one, I'd say, is chapter 11, right towards the end. That one's going to be another detail-heavy chapter. But anyway, this one, there's a lot of things to take note on. So I went ahead, I printed off some extra note pages. You may not need them. Maybe you will. But Daniel 5, it's my favorite chapter of Daniel. And I was mentioning this to Christina the other day, too. And I said, we're going to be Daniel 5. And she knew what that was. And she said it's her favorite one in Daniel. And I can't really explain why it's my favorite. I mean, I don't know. It's just something about it. It's a cool little story to me. It's kind of a creepy ghost story almost. And anyway, so there's a lot of great stuff in Daniel, though. Especially a lot of stories you hear growing up. Maybe you heard this one growing up. So anyway, Daniel, you guys know, it starts off with the Babylonian captivity when Daniel is a teenager. By the time of this story, Daniel is an old man in this story. He's he's like at least 80 years old, I think. At the time of this story, maybe older than that. He's at least 80 years old. So he's not the young person that we started the book of Daniel with. Daniel covers two different world empires. And so the first one, of course, is Babylon. That's where it starts. It has 7 chapters that take place in Babylon. And so we are on the 7th chapter of the Babylon portion of Daniel. After this, it's going to be in Persia. And so anyway, we've been also going through Daniel in chronological order. And so that's why we were in 7 and 8 the past couple weeks, and now we're going back to chapter 5. And so with your notes, I mean, if you want to put your notes in numerical order of Daniel, whatever you want to do with your notebooks. If you want to leave it in chronological order, that's fine too. I'll just leave that up to you. But go ahead and get your Bibles and turn to Daniel chapter 5. And this is about, since I said it's the last Babylon story, this is a story that all takes place in one night, and it is the last night of the Babylonian Empire. The last night that Babylon is going to be a world kingdom. And so we're going to talk about Babylon's past and Babylon's future today. Futures in the future. Yes, it's interesting. This is the last night of the Babylonian Empire, but we'll also talk about Babylon's future. And so I'll explain what that is whenever we get there. But here we are at Daniel chapter 5, and I'll just start reading here. We'll just go through verse 1 really quick. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. And let's stop there for just a second. Who is this Belshazzar, or Belshazzar, however you want to say his name? Who exactly is that? Who's the king that we've mainly been dealing with through Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar. And so he's been the main person that has been like a lot of stories around him. This is a different king. Belshazzar is probably Nebuchadnezzar's maybe like grandson or someone else down in his line. The Bible doesn't say exactly. It'll say later that Nebuchadnezzar is his father, but that's just a word that means like ancestor. It doesn't necessarily mean your direct father. It's kind of like whenever we say George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were our founding fathers. Well, we don't really mean that they were our literal fathers. We just mean they were our ancestors, well, those who went before us. And so this guy is probably Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and he's the king at this time. He was also the king during the past couple chapters, it would say, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, and then Daniel would give, in chapter 8, that's what it says. So he's been king for a little while. This is the last night that he's going to be king. And this is one of the chapters that will make people try to discredit the book of Daniel. And they'll say, well, see, Daniel, someone just made that up years after these things happened, and it's not true. And the reason they'll say that, or they used to say that, the reason they used to say that is because when you look in history, Belshazzar was not mentioned. All the history texts from the ancient historians, they would always write that King Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. Belshazzar is never mentioned. And so people would look at Daniel and they'd say, see, Daniel doesn't know what he's talking about because Belshazzar wasn't the last king of Babylon. The last king of Babylon was Nabonidus. That's what all the historical documents say. And so that was what the prevailing thought was for hundreds of years. People would discredit Daniel and say it wasn't true because of getting this last king of Babylon wrong. Can you guess what maybe one of the explanations people used to give why does history say Nabonidus is the last king, but Daniel says Belshazzar is the last king? What is a possible explanation people could put forward for that? Yeah, it's like his name in a different language or something like that. So they'd say, well, that's what the Christian historians or Jewish historians, that's what they would say. Well, they'd say it was still written by Daniel, but it was just a different name for Nabonidus. They're the same person. And that could be plausible because there's lots of people in the Bible who had two different names, like Daniel. Lots of people had two different names. And so that could have been it. However, over time, there was a historical document uncovered, and it's called the Babylonian. You can write this down in just a second. This is called the Babylonian Chronicle, and it didn't look just like this. That's a section of a column, and it was these large columns that they found in Babylon, the city, in the 1850s, so about 150 years ago. And on this column, it told the story. It said, Nabonidus was the last king. However, he didn't really like being king. Nabonidus was a pretty interesting guy. Archaeologists call him the first archaeologist. They say that's what they call him. They say Nabonidus was the first archaeologist because he loved history. He loved going on expeditions and traveling and looking at historical things. And so Nabonidus didn't really care very much about being king. And the people, from what I read, didn't like him as king very much either. Maybe because he just wasn't very interested. And so he would often just be gone on journeys. He was constantly gone on long journeys. And whenever he was gone, he would leave his son in charge. And his son was named Belshazzar. And so Belshazzar basically, he ran the kingdom. Nabonidus was the official king, and you can write this down if you want now. I put it up there in quotation marks. He was the official king, but he left the kingdom under the rule of his son while he was away on journeys, which was almost all of the time. And like I said, he was a historian. He loved restoring ancient ruins and digging up archaeological sites. And that's kind of funny because now we dig up archaeological sites about him, and that's what he was doing for other, peoples that had lived before him. And he also built museums in Babylon to show off the things that he found. But the actual functioning king was Belshazzar. And so that's who Daniel writes about. So people would try to discredit Daniel, and they'd say, see, Daniel doesn't know what he's talking about because he says Belshazzar was the king. Well, as it turns out, Daniel is the only other person who has a record of Belshazzar, except for this Babylonian Chronicle. Daniel is the only person who does know what he's talking about, because no other historians would write about Belshazzar. And so instead of discrediting Daniel, it actually makes Daniel that much more credible, because he's the only other person in history who was writing about Belshazzar. Yeah.
What do you call that document?
The Babylonian Chronicle. That's what people call it today. He probably didn't. Then maybe it was in one of their old museums, and that was how they stored, instead of having like a plaque like we would in a museum, they wrote it on the column next to, I'm just guessing, I really don't know. But they were on columns, like these things written, so that's a section of it right there. That's what it looked like. And the Babylonian Chronicle, when they discovered that, it unearthed a lot of information about Babylon that they didn't know before. And so one of those things was Belshazzar. And so I just think it's cool how for hundreds of years people would try to use that to give excuses not to believe the Bible and not to believe Daniel. And yet, in the end, the truth proved that you can trust Daniel because he's the only one who knew about this because he lived at that time. Belshazzar, of course, he has a name. His name is kind of similar to someone else we've been reading about in Daniel. Belteshazzar. Yeah. Daniel's pagan name that was given to him. And if you remember, I think it means Bel's prince. That's what Belteshazzar means, or Belshazzar. And so what I read about Belshazzar, I knew it had to be something similar. Belshazzar means, may Bel protect the king. So it's a pagan name also. So in this story, Belshazzar is having a huge party. The night, that we can know from history, it was October 12th, 539 BC. October 12th, 539 BC. We can look at history and figure out the exact day this happened because we know when Babylon's last night was, whenever it fell. And the history also tells us that 10 days prior to this story, Babylon's forces were obliterated by Persia, their military forces. They had lost a huge battle, a lot of them died, and they knew Babylon wouldn't have a very good, sustainable military force for much longer, so they knew that their days were pretty much up. And so what are they doing here? They're having a big party. And there's different ideas of why they would be having a big party. The most common one is that Belshazzar knows that people are probably disappointed with him and think he's failed as king because his kingdom's about to be wiped out. And so he's throwing a big party to kind of keep people's spirits up and make them feel like, things aren't really that bad. And see, we can still have a good time. And they don't even know that the Persians are surrounding Babylon as this party is going on. Okay, so let's go on to verse 2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. It tells us that pretty much twice because it's really trying to emphasize what they're doing. They're drinking from golden vessels that used to be in God's temple. And it says they drank wine and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. These things that they were drinking out of, those were referenced back in the first chapter. And you don't have to write this. Anytime I throw up a Bible verse, it's too much to write down, so don't feel like you have to write Bible verses down. I just put them up for information for you guys to see. And in the very, very beginning of Daniel, in the first lesson, we talked about this. The third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave him into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God. So this was set up back in the first chapter. It mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar didn't just take the people, he took some of the articles of the house of God. And so those, I guess, have been sitting in Babylon until this night, which is the last night of the Babylonian Empire. And on that night, they bring these things back out. And they're drinking out of them, and they're praising gods of wood and stone and stuff like that, while drinking out of God's cups. And so it's just disrespectful. And some people might say, well, how could he disrespect God if he didn't even know who God was? Like, how could someone disrespect God if they don't believe in God? And someone might ask that question. But apparently from this story, God still takes that pretty seriously. Even if you didn't believe in him, if you still disrespected him, God takes that seriously based on what else happens in this chapter. And so it says in verse 5, in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. And I like how they describe it there. So he sees a hand writing on the wall, and he's very freaked out by it. It says his knees knocked together. It's very descriptive of what happened to him there. This is one of the most unique stories in the Bible. There's not really another story that's like this one. And it doesn't tell us right here what the hand wrote, but it does say that they couldn't figure out what it was said. And so it probably wasn't written in Aramaic. God was probably writing it, I would guess, in Hebrew, because none of these were Hebrew people in this room. So he probably wrote it in Hebrew, and that's why Daniel will come in later and be able to read it. None of the other people could. But I don't know what was written in. It could have been in a totally unfamiliar language to anybody. But anyway, verse 7, and the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. And then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. You know, it's kind of funny in Daniel, every time something weird happens, or they have a dream or whatever, and the king doesn't know what to do, who's the first people he runs to? He runs to like his astrologers and magicians and the soothsayers, and he goes to them for the answers every time, but he always goes to the man of God last. Have you noticed that pattern? And guys, be careful who you go to for advice. You know, when something is going wrong, I'd say always go to a Christian for advice. And that's not to say that 100% of the time a Christian's going to give you the best answer. I mean, Christians aren't perfect. But in general, we should be able to trust Christians instead of running to people of the world. Because people in the world, they don't know anything. They don't have the truth. They don't believe in the truth. And so you're not going to get a perfect answer from them most of the time. They're often going to have probably a sinful answer or something like that. Be careful who you go to for the truth, guys. They always go to the man of God last in these stories. And in this story, the fact that he goes to the man of God last, it's too late for him. And I'll explain that in a little while. So Belshazzar makes a huge offer to whoever can interpret the writing that's on there. And then in verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. So this queen, she wasn't a part of everything else that was going on. And since it said Belshazzar had all his wives there and the queen was somewhere else, the queen is probably his mother or his grandmother. That's probably who this queen is. And so she would be the queen until she died. Someone else would be queen. So she's the queen. She comes in and she says, "O king, live forever. Do not let your hearts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." So she remembers Daniel from back when Nebuchadnezzar was around. She remembers Daniel, and she says, now this guy knows how to figure this stuff out. In fact, he was in charge of all the magicians and soothsayers and blah, blah, blah. He was in charge of all them back whenever your father or your grandfather was king. And so these are the attributes that they bring up that make Daniel someone that they want to turn to. And you don't have to write down all 5 bullet points or 6 here. You can if you want to. But I kind of condensed them into this one sentence at the bottom. And so the attributes that made Daniel someone they wanted to turn to for advice, it said that he had an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, dream interpretation, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas. And those last 3, those are referring to like his spiritual walk with God that made him be able to interpret dreams and stuff like that. Like when it says solving riddles, they're bringing him in to solve a riddle that's written on this wall, is basically what's going on. And so I've condensed it down. I said Daniel was recognized for his excellent spirit, his intelligence, that would be his knowledge and understanding, and his God-given gifts, because that's how he could explain these enigmas, these things no one else could understand. It was all from God. And so you have it. It's referring there to his character. Let me see if that's on the next thing. It's not. His character is something there that they're pointing out. That's what it means when it says he has an excellent spirit. You know, to have an excellent spirit means that to be excellent means that you're trying to be better than the rest. You're trying to be above and beyond. That's what it means when you say someone is excelling at something, or they excel at this. It means that they're doing better than the average. All right? Does that make sense? And so when you should strive to have an excellent spirit. Don't be someone who strives to do just as good as everyone else. Don't just strive to just be like everybody else is. Strive to be better. And that's what Daniel always did. And so he was always recognized for his excellent spirit. And then knowledge and understanding, that was about his intelligence. And dream interpretation, solving riddles, explaining enigmas, that was about his spirituality. So he was renowned for his character, his intelligence, and his spirituality. All 3 of those things are what made Daniel who he was. All 3 of those are important. In verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who's one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard of you, and the spirit of the God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give an interpretation to the king, or of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be 3rd ruler in the kingdom." And so he offers him all this stuff. 3rd ruler in the kingdom, clothed with purple, gold chain around your neck. This sounds a lot like an earlier story, doesn't it? Do you guys remember when, it's kind of like the same pattern with Nebuchadnezzar, and he has that dream, and he says, Daniel, if you can interpret the dream for me, I'll give you all these things. And it was very similar to this stuff. There was one significant difference, though. What's different this time than what Nebuchadnezzar offered Daniel? Does anybody remember? It was where he said here, "You'll be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Now, when Daniel was before Nebuchadnezzar said you'll be the 2nd ruler in the kingdom. So it's a little bit different this time. And the reason for that, this time it's the 3rd. The reason for that is because remember, Nabonidus is actually the official king. So he would be first. Belshazzar is the one filling in while Nabonidus is gone, so he would be second. So Daniel would be third. So third is the best he can do. That's why he says third this time. Yeah.
Also, this offer has a shorter expiration date.
I was going to point that out at the end, but that's true. This offer is not going to be good for very long. Oh, you're third ruler in the kingdom, and then Daniel probably doesn't even care because he knows that the next morning the kingdom's going to be gone. And so it'd be kind of like if I said, Hannah, I'm going to give you $1 million, but in 2 hours we're all switching over to the euro. What's the $1 million going to do for her, right? Yeah, you could go crazy for 2 hours. So anyway, it's not a very good offer, but it is. I guess it's probably the best Belshazzar can do at this point. So Daniel's not very impressed with it. And before we get into how he responds, I just want you to picture this for a minute. So Belshazzar's a pretty young guy. He's probably in his 20s or his 30s. And he's having this party. And he's the king, though. He's not that smart, but this guy, he's the king. And he has to call in this old man for advice. And Daniel's 70 or 80 or maybe even 90 years old. I could figure it out, but I didn't do the math. Daniel's a really old guy. Okay, he comes in. Maybe he's like Brother Riley's age. I don't know exactly how old Brother Riley is. But imagine like I'm the king, okay, at 25 years old. And I have to go to Brother Riley. I'm like, I can't figure out this problem. And imagine like Brother Riley having to come in and figure it out, do it for me. Often in the world, people are impressed by status. Oh, you're the king. Well, you must know what's best. We adore you. Often people are impressed by status. What we should be impressed by is character. Okay, the king he had a high status. He didn't have very good character. And so in the end, they have to turn to the old guy. He's the one who had the strong character. And so I just want you to make a note of that, because we do often get it the other way around, especially the world. The world just thinks that your label, your position, or your status, they think that that's just the thing to go for. They think that's what makes you who you are. Some people, the first thing they want to know about you, what do you do? What's your job? Because that's how they think your identity comes from, that is what your position is. And we should be looking for character. If you can see this at the bottom, status is limited to this world. Okay, for Belshazzar, it's limited to that night now. That's the end of it. Godly character is eternal. That actually has an eternal impact. Status, oh, hey, Daniel, you're third ruler in the kingdom. How long is that going to last? We don't care about Daniel's status. We care about his character. And so that's what we want to learn from. So Daniel, of course, he's not too impressed with the king. And it says in verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. He says, give your rewards to another. And I'm thinking, if I were Daniel, if I was third in the kingdom and I knew the kingdom was going to get taken that night, then I probably wouldn't want to be third in the kingdom. I'd want to just fade into the background, because they're probably going to, I would be afraid like they're going to go around killing the people who are on top. He says, let your rewards be to another. Yet I will read the king the writing and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. So he starts off before he actually gets into what the words say. He's telling Belshazzar, this is what God did for your father. He says, your father put, he says, God put your father on the throne. God gave your father the kingdom of Babylon. And that's the whole theme of Daniel, is that God is sovereign, and so God is in control of who's in control. And so that he's stating the whole theme of the book of Daniel right there. I might have called it the theme of Babylon a second ago. I meant the whole theme of Daniel. It's that God is in control. And so let me challenge you on this. Does that mean that God gave England to the Queen of England? Anyone?
Yes.
Yes, he gave England to the Queen of England. Does that mean he gave the United States to Barack Obama? Yes. Does that mean he gave Germany to Hitler? Definitely. The answer to all those is yes. God gave the kingdoms to those men, or the women too sometimes, to rule over that. And it's always God who gives it to them. And we might think, well, why would God give Germany to Hitler with all the stuff Hitler was going to do? God wanted it. Now listen, just because God puts someone in charge of something, he wants them to do good at it. He wants them to do right. And so when God makes Hitler the ruler, it doesn't mean that God wants Hitler to go try to wipe out the Jews. But he puts Hitler in that position and lets Hitler decide how Hitler's going to rule. And God will judge Hitler by that. Hitler can't say, well, God, you put me in charge. God's going to say, Hitler, you had a decision. You decided to do one of the most evil things anybody in history's ever done. So Hitler will be held accountable for how he ruled, but God is the one who decided to put him there. And that's even true for America. And I know we think, well, we have elections, so we vote who the president's going to be. We vote who's going to be in charge. But I know we should vote, but I think God cares how we vote. And we should vote for the right person. We shouldn't try to pick who's just most likely to win and vote for them and say, well, God's probably picking that person. But we should vote for the person who would be the most moral and best leader and all that stuff. So it's important to vote, but in the end, the reason Barack Obama is there instead of Mitt Romney or John McCain is because God chose for Barack Obama to be there. He worked it out. If God didn't want Barack Obama there, he could have worked it out to where Barack Obama never would have got close. God could have done that because God can do anything. And so he's always the one in control. It doesn't mean that God blesses whatever Barack Obama wants to do, or George Bush wants to do, or Bill Clinton, or the other Bush, or Ronald Reagan. It doesn't mean that God blesses them and everything that they want to do. They all have decisions to do good or evil. But they are the people God put on the throne for that time. And so that's just the way it works. And that's what Daniel here is pointing out to Belshazzar. And so it says in verse 19, and because of the majesty that God gave Nebuchadnezzar, all peoples, nations, and language trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished he executed, whomever he wished he kept alive, whomever he wished he set up, and whomever he wished he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with wild donkeys. And they fed him grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints it over whomever he chooses. So Daniel's recounting that story that we read about before, when Nebuchadnezzar had his mind taken from him, basically. Verse 22, but you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this, and you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They've brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. And so he just pointing all this stuff out to him and says, you're doing just what your father did. This is what happened, or your grandfather. This is what happened to him. And so God can do the exact same thing to you. And it's about pride once again. We had a whole lesson on pride last time, and I'm not going to redo that one. But it's all about pride once again. And so let's talk about for a second, though, why were these kings so proud? Like, what was so great about Babylon that made them such a proud person? Well, I'm going to show you a few pictures. And whenever you think about the magnitude and everything that Babylon had accomplished, let me just challenge you with this. If you were king or queen of Babylon and you had accomplished all this stuff, you might have been kind of proud too. Just think about that. One of the things that was very renowned in Babylon were these things called the Hanging Gardens. And the Hanging Gardens were, they had found some way to get water to go to the top of this building. This is the building right here. And they had found some way to get water to go to the top of this building. And they thought, they figured out a way to put plants all along so the water would flow down and water all the plants. I don't know how they did it. People today aren't sure how they did it, because it was like a stone building or whatever, brick building. They aren't sure how they did it, but they got the water up there and it watered the plants and it was beautiful, and people would come from all over to see the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It's one of the ancient, they're like the seven wonders of the world things. This is one of those because it was so awesome. Babylon, when you hear about the seven wonders of the world, Babylon had two of them. Okay, and I'll get to another one in a second. But there were the Hanging Gardens. They had this thing called the ziggurat, and it was just a massive structure. And right here, this is like someone made a little miniature Babylon and tried to show the kind of stuff it would have. This right here was the Temple of Marduk, and it was Marduk was one of their false gods, and it was this big, beautiful building. The Ishtar Gate, and that's just a part of it. The Ishtar Gate was a very big structure. anybody who walked into Babylon walked through the Ishtar gate. And Ishtar was one of those false gods that they had in Babylon. It's actually where the word Easter comes from, which is why I don't like to say the word Easter. It comes from this Ishtar god that people used to worship. And so they had this, I mean, when you look at this, this is the actual Ishtar gate. It's in a museum in Berlin. And in this Ishtar gate, you can just imagine Daniel would have walked through that probably lots of times. He probably walked right through that arch, because that's what you'd enter as you were going into Babylon. The walls of Babylon, and I don't know where this picture's from, if someone recreated it or what, I don't know. The walls of Babylon were 100 feet high, and they were 50 feet wide. These were massively wide. And so you could take 2 chariots being pulled by horses across the walls, like running down the walls. They were huge, and they were expansive. I don't know exactly. I read up on how big Babylon was, and I don't remember the exact measurements, but it was, from what I understood, it was about the size of Joplin. Like if we're at one corner of Joplin here, Babylon would have gone like to the other, down to like College Heights, that corner, then down to like Flying J, over to Stone's Corner. That's probably about how big Babylon was, and it was a big, thick city. And they had these huge walls all the way around it. 100-foot high walls. Think of how much work went into making walls. That's the other thing that's one of the wonders of the world, because this was so huge. Yeah. I mean, that wasn't just in Babylon. I mean, Rahab lived in the wall too. That's how she was able to let the spies out. It's because she had a window through the wall. But anyway, yeah, people could live in the walls. These were massive walls. And I couldn't find proof of this, but I heard there were alligators with a moat on the other side. So if someone actually climbed over the walls, they would go right into alligators anyway, if it was dark. I don't know if that's for real. That's what I only read that in one book, and it didn't have a historical citation. So I don't think someone just made it up, but I don't know that for a fact. So anyway, I think I would have been, if you just think of the walls alone, and you were in charge of this city that had that huge and all these walls and stuff, I can imagine it'd be pretty easy to get proud of that. It'd be pretty easy to think, man, I'm pretty cool for having all this. Even if he didn't build all of it in his lifetime, just to be in charge of it all. I mean, that is very honorable to have that much power given to you and authority. I mean, that is something to be honored. And so it's easy to imagine how they got prideful over that. But just because it's easy to get prideful, that's not an excuse for it. And let me just point something out for you. And when I was thinking about this, I mean, I don't know if I want to believe this, but I have to because it's in the Bible. But I kind of have to choke these words out because this is like really something hard to swallow. Daniel's recounting to Belshazzar all the things that Nebuchadnezzar had done. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, whoever he wanted to kill, he killed. Whoever he wanted to spare, he spared. He just would decide, oh, you die. And they'd kill him in gruesome ways. Threw people into fiery furnaces. Made statues of himself that people had to bow down to. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar did all those things. Killed a bunch of the Jews. He marched into into Jerusalem and killed 1/3 of the Jews. And then burned another third of them. This was a bad guy. Did Daniel say, so Nebuchadnezzar was given the mind of a beast and humbled and all that because he killed a bunch of people? Because he was a jerk? Because he killed a bunch of the Jews? Because he threw people in fiery furnaces? Is that the reason that he was humbled and given the mind of a beast for 7 years? No, it's not. When Daniel's talking to Belshazzar, does he say, well, Belshazzar, your kingdom's going to be taken from you tonight and you're going to die, and it's all because you're a bad guy who's killed people? Does he say that? In both cases, what is the reason those things happened? Pride. He says, Nebuchadnezzar killed people. He killed whoever he wanted. He threw people in fiery furnaces. But the reason God kicked him off his throne for 7 years was because of his pride. And so that's why I call pride the big one, the big sin. And that's why it made the devil the devil. And we can think, well, okay, maybe if I was king of Babylon, maybe I would be prideful, but I wouldn't be evil like them and kill people and throw them in lions' dens and throw them in fiery furnaces. I wouldn't do that kind of stuff. I mean, we can understand the pride, but we would think, but I wouldn't do all that other stuff, so I wouldn't be as bad as them. Well, all those things that they did, that's not what got them kicked off the throne. It was their pride. And so we got to watch pride, guys. We got to be careful about that, because that just kind of blows me away to think That is the big sin that God had a problem with them with. Not that they were even killing people. He comes after them for their pride. Just something really to think about. Okay, we'll go on through the chapter. Okay, in chapter 24, Daniel finally gets to what the hands had written. In verse 24, it says, "Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." It's kind of weird that, we've got one word, but when Daniel interprets it, he gives like an entire sentence of what that one word means. And so I've always been kind of weirded out by that story, and like, how does one little word, it's kind of like whenever you see if you ever see like Japanese people speaking on a movie, and they'll just be like, "Hoi, cha, oi," and then like the subtitles will be this really long thing. Have you ever noticed that? Like when Japanese people speak, they'll just say a couple things and it'll be really long. And so I thought, well, I guess it's something kind of like that. Here's what this is what Daniel's actually doing. Those words are just single words. They just mean one thing. But Daniel goes a step farther and says what the significance of the word means. So he gives the technical interpretation, but then he also gives a spiritual application. And you might just want to circle those or something like that and learn what those two things are. A technical interpretation and a spiritual application. Anything you read in the Bible will have both of those. Let's take Leviticus, because people think, well, Leviticus can't mean anything to me anymore because it talks about sacrifices and washings and things we don't have to do anymore. And so people think, well, why read Leviticus? Well, Leviticus has a technical interpretation, but it has a spiritual application. Okay, so the Leviticus will say, go wash this off of you before you come into God's house because you're supposed to be holy. Or it'll say, go kill these 2 birds for a sacrifice because that will make you holy before the Lord. Okay, now the technical interpretation would be to go and do those things. But we already know we aren't supposed to go do those things anymore. But those things have a spiritual application. And so with Leviticus, and you don't have to write all this down, I'm just giving you an idea of how this works. Leviticus mentions the word holy like 100 times, maybe 200. It's like a crazy high number. Leviticus mentions the holiness of God again and again and again. Okay, whenever we read Leviticus, we aren't always going to have the technical interpretation that applies to us. But if you want to think about the holiness of God and have the holiness of God impressed upon you, go and read the book of Leviticus. And you'll come away from that book and you'll think, God is a holy God. He cares a lot about holiness. And that's our spiritual application. So that's how those two things work. Anything you read in the Bible, even if the technical interpretation does not apply to you, there will be a spiritual application that can help you out. And so what Daniel does is he gives both here. And the first word, which is on there twice, mene, it means, the technical interpretation, it just means to count or to number. But Daniel goes a step further and he says, this is why God is writing the word mene on there. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. And the same with tekel. The word tekel means to weigh. And so Daniel says, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And then the last word there is Peres. And I know when it was written, it said upharsin, and when it showed up, when he talked about it, he said Peres. And it was something about the translation. I didn't really understand it, but I can't really explain it to you why that is. It's basically the same letters, PRS. That's the significant thing there. It's the same letters there, so don't worry about that. But Peres, it means divided, or it can also mean Persian. And so the definition or the application that Daniel gives here, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. The reason that word has two meanings, God is using a pun right here. You guys know a pun? A pun is whenever you say a word, but the word has two different meanings. That's often called a pun. And people make it out of jokes and stuff like that. Well, God's actually using a pun here. I don't know if you want to call it funny or not. But he says your kingdom is going to be divided. But that same word also means Persian. And so his kingdom is going to be Persianized because the Persians are going to come take it. So it's a double meaning thing. It's just kind of humorous. But anyway, that's what it means right there. Mene is repeated twice. I have a theory about that. which I'll get to at the end of the lesson. I kept looking. I couldn't find why many was repeated twice and everything else was once. But I have a theory about it, so we'll get to that. But anyway, there's a lot. We get a lot of these expressions. We use these in the real world today. You'll hear these a lot. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You hear that a lot. And back in the early 90s, or late 90s, there was a movie called A Knight's Tale. And it was about a knight who worked for the king, rode horses, had a sword, did jousting. It had Heath Ledger. And I just remember, I don't really remember what it was about. I think he was like, the king or the prince didn't like him, and so had him kicked out of the army. So he like changed his name or put on a mask or something and worked his way up to be a knight again. And like that was what the movie was about. I don't really remember, but I always remember I watched it like when I was 9 years old, and at the end of the movie, the bad guy is like getting killed, but right before like the death blow comes to him and he dies, he just like everything, it's kind of a weird movie, and everything freezes, and he has like this vision of people coming to him, and they say, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your days are numbered. And he like says all this vision of all those things happening. And I didn't know what it was from. And I don't know why the movie was even referring to Daniel. But that comes from Daniel. When people say you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, it actually comes from that. And so that's why I called this lesson today A Knight's Tale. But I changed it. It's not a knight like in the army or King's Army. It's a knight like an evening, you know. So it's a pun. That is a pun, I think. No, it's not. Anyway, okay. It's close enough. So anyway, but this whole story of Daniel chapter 5, it takes place in one night. So I called it A Knight's Tale. And you know, it's kind of funny. I was just thinking about also when Daniel had to give Nebuchadnezzar an interpretation to the dream, and it was like not a good interpretation. It was like really negative. Daniel says, "O king, live forever." Do you guys remember that? Every time, "O king, live forever. This is what it says. Oh no." And Daniel's always very concerned. And he doesn't even bother with that this time, because he knows the vision says your days are numbered. He's not saying, "O king, live forever." This is what he does say in verse 29. And then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Do you think that maybe Belshazzar just didn't really get it? Like, okay, my kingdom's going to fall. Daniel, thanks for telling me that. You can be and they make a proclamation about it. And it's like, you should be running out of the city, you know, get in a rowboat and get in the Euphrates River and row away. That's what I would be doing. But anyway, and so it says in the last verses of the chapter, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so I'll tell you a little bit here about how Babylon fell. Here's a drawing that someone made of it. And like I said, from what I understand, it was about the size of Joplin. So that would be kind of about, you can kind of get a sense of the scale and stuff there. And you know, I guess those giant walls, it looks like they go all the way out here. So they aren't right on the edge of the city. They are over here. But anyway, that is an artist's rendition of the ancient city of Babylon, what it probably could have looked like. Here's how it fell in a single night. The Persians were surrounded, while all this was going on, the Persians were surrounding the city. And historians, you know, the Bible just mentioned there's a party going on at Belshazzar's house. Historians actually have written about, there's lots of writings about the end of Babylon. And the whole city was having a big party. It wasn't just the house right here, probably here in the middle. The whole city was having a huge party. And they were just getting drunk. And they were probably just trying to, in denial, or just trying to have a big, you know, we're not going to die. We're not going to fall. Let's just live it up. I don't know I don't know what they were thinking. But historians say that these walls were just considered impenetrable. They didn't think anybody would ever break into these walls. Because like I said, they were 100 feet tall and 50 feet thick. And so anyone who could even get up the walls, they could just kill them when they got to the top. You know, they thought they could fight off any invasion. And they had a 20-year food supply stored up in the city. And so if they didn't need to get out, they could live for 20 years in there. That's pretty good. I mean, America can't do that. Well, I've read before that, you know, if something happened, they only have a 4-day supply of food at about any given time. And so America couldn't last 20 years unless they just started growing their own stuff. But anyway, as I heard, they had 20 years worth of stuff, and they had a water source. That's the Euphrates River right here. It goes right through Babylon. And so they were pretty well taken care of. They probably just didn't think, if they thought, well, if the rest of the kingdom falls, Babylon, the city, will be safe and we'll be living happily ever after. So they probably just weren't too concerned about stuff. Well, this is what the Persians did. Because it's true. How were they going to get through the walls and then fight the alligators if that was there? How were they going to take the city? So the Persians got an idea. It's pretty smart. They started digging that night, and there was a lake somewhere nearby, and so they dug a channel and connected the river to the lake and made the river flow into the lake. So the river just dried up there. It either got very, very low or it just dried up. And when that happened, they were able to go right underneath. And there were apparently like walls going across. When the river was gone, they just walked right underneath the wall and got into the city. And so they just walked right in. And that's how they got in there. There's a little bit more to it. So maybe the Babylonians thought that could have been a possibility. So they had also walls around the river. So that, if someone just came up, swam through the river, they couldn't just walk into the city. There's walls on the inside too. And so the Babylonians had thought that far ahead. So these Persians just they've dug a channel or whatever, and I guess they're walking down through the riverbed, and they're in the area of the city. Well, on these walls that were inside the city by the water, they had doors on the walls just in case, I think this is probably pretty common. Somebody would be acting stupid, or maybe there's a drunk party going on, and somebody would do something stupid and fall in the water, and they'd say, help, I'm going to get washed away, and they'd knock on the doors, and they'd open the door and let them back in. That's just what people would do back then. So the Persians, they walk into the city, and they're like, well, how are we going to get past the walls on the inside? And so apparently one of them just walks up, one of these Persian soldiers, knocks on the door. One of the guards, I don't know if he's drunk or just thinks maybe someone's fallen in, opens the door. All the Persians fled into the city. And so that's how Babylon fell. They just, someone opened the door and just let them right in. And they walked in and slayed a bunch of people, killed the king. It said they killed Belshazzar that night. And they flooded into the city. So it was actually ended up being that simple. And by the way, I'll just say, I don't literally know if they knocked on the door or if the historian said they made some kind of sound. And so it made it, maybe they said, help, I fell in, or something like that. They made some sort of sound that would make someone think, oh, someone fell over the wall. Let's let them back in. But it ended up being that simple. And so that is the tale of how Babylon fell in a single night. We're done with Daniel 5. That was Daniel 5. So we talked about, let's talk about where Babylon came from really quick. Because it didn't just start like later on. It is actually founded by a man named Nimrod in Genesis chapters 10 and 11. Nimrod was a guy who tried to build a tower to heaven, and he started it in a city called Babel. And so you guys know the story of the Tower of Babel. But it's not just called the Tower of Babel. That is the city that he built. It was called Babel. Later had its name changed to Babylon. But it was the same place. And so that's where it came from. Nimrod wanted to start a one-world religion and a one-world government. Isn't that kind of interesting? Does that sound like anyone else you know? One-world religion, one-world government. That was Nimrod's plan. It sounds like Batman. You're right. It does. So anyway, we get to Daniel 5. Babylon's been the ruler of the world, the kingdom of the world, and it falls in a single night. And that was the end of the Babylonian Empire. 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 So are we clear on that that was the end of the Babylonian Empire? Yes.
So
I wanted to make sure we're clear.
Then how can there be a future of the Babylon?
That was the end of the Babylonian Empire, but that was not the end of Babylon. Babylon, the city, did not disappear that night, even though they flooded in and took it. They didn't just burn it to the ground and it's gone forever. That's not what happened. Let's see what happened to Babylon after Daniel 5. If you come to Ezra chapter 7, in verse 6 and in verse 9, this was 75 years after Daniel 5, 75 years later, and it says, Ezra came up from Babylon, and he was a skilled scribe in the law of Moses. And on the first day of the first month, he began his journey from Babylon. And on the first day of the fifth month, he came to Jerusalem. Babylon shows up again as a dwelling place in Ezra 7, and this was during the Persian Empire. Now, if you want to write about what empire it was, you can. I mean, you don't have to if you don't want to. I just put that in for extra info. But it's mentioned again 75 years later in Ezra 7. So that was 75 years later. And then Alexander the Great established his capital in Babylon during his reign of the Greek Empire. That would have been about 200 years after Daniel chapter 5. Alexander the Great ruled from Babylon. That's where he made his capital. And we know he didn't live very long, but he lived there. That was his capital of the Greek Empire. And so Babylon's still around 200 years later at least. And as you're writing that one down, I'll tell you about one more person. Peter, as in the disciple, the apostle Peter, he apparently started a church in Babylon, and that would have been during the Roman Empire. That was 500 years after Daniel chapter 5. And he writes in 1 Peter 5:13, she who is in Babylon, the church there, elect together with you, greets you. So he's writing a letter, he's mentioning this is what they say in the church in Babylon. So Babylon is still a city at the time of Peter being alive, 500 years later, 1 Peter chapter 5, during the Roman Empire. And I just add those in because we talk about these empires already through the lessons. And then people live in Babylon today. And I remember that video I showed you guys a few weeks ago? Do you guys remember that? Of Saddam Hussein had started restoring the city of Babylon. And so that started in the 1980s. And they didn't show this on the video, but people live there today. It's functioning like started up as a city again. And so probably the part the video focused on was some of the ruins, but it's still around today. And so it didn't exist for a long time. It got whittled away, and that's why Saddam Hussein restarted it. It disappeared for a long time, but it's back now. Okay, and there's a reason I'm bringing all that up, why I'm having you guys write this stuff down. You know, Saddam Hussein was so evil. He killed like thousands and thousands of his own people. In fact, so Babylon, it's in where today it's Iraq, and that's where Saddam Hussein was the leader of. And in one day, he gassed 200,000 of his own Iraqi people. He gassed them. There are people who lived in the northern part of Iraq, and do you know why he gassed them? Because they were, in the northern Iraq, it was the area of the Kurds. And the Kurds used to be the Medes. That's what they used to be, from the Medo-Persian Empire. And Saddam Hussein's a Babylonian. He hated the Kurds, the Medes, because of what they had done to Babylon a long time before. And so he gassed, the Kurds to get back at them. He's getting revenge. Why is all of this significant? Like, who cares that people still live in Babylon today? What's the point? Well, in Jeremiah chapters 51 and 52, Jeremiah gives 2 chapters of prophecy against Babylon. And he says again and again and again in these chapters, Jeremiah keeps writing, Babylon will be destroyed and nobody will ever live there again. He says that 7 times. Nobody will ever live in Babylon again. You don't have to write down the verses right here. But you might want to write down this part up here. It's chapters 50 and 51. He gives several prophecies. 7 times he says, no one will ever live in Babylon ever again because it's going to be so utterly destroyed. Like in 51:29, and the land will tremble and sorrow, for every purpose of the Lord shall be performed against Babylon, to make the land of Babylon a desolation without inhabitant. And then it says, O Lord, you've spoken against this place to cut it off so that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but it shall be desolate forever. And so it says again and again, no one will ever live in Babylon today. Okay, so let me ask you guys a question. Has this prophecy come true yet? Now, some people will say, oh yeah, that prophecy came true back in Daniel chapter 5. They wiped it out. And they'll say, see, that's whenever that prophecy came true. But do we know from history and from the Bible itself, and just looking out on CNN today, that prophecy has not come true yet. And so Babylon is still yet to be destroyed, so desolate that no one will ever live in it again. And so we might say, well, when is that going to happen? Like, what's going to be the point of that? Well, Revelation actually tells us. So the Bible itself shows that this prophecy hasn't come true yet. When is it going to come true? Well, Babylon will someday be the political capital of the Antichrist's one world empire, according to Revelation chapter 18. The Antichrist himself is going to rule, and his capital of his political part of his nation, it will be in Babylon. And so Babylon, there's still some things that are planned for Babylon. However, we also can see from Revelation, Babylon will be wiped out at Jesus' second coming. And I'll read you the verses here. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And so it says in Revelation 18, Babylon is going to fall again. I want to draw attention to this one phrase right here. You don't have to write down, it's a verse, don't write it down. Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. And people say, well, why does it say that twice? Like that expression, it's an interesting expression. It doesn't just show up all the time in the Bible. Why does it say Babylon is fallen, is fallen? And the most common explanation is because Babylon is falling twice. It fell once in Daniel 5, and it will fall again in the future. So there's two fallings of Babylon. The end of the Babylonian Empire, but when Jesus comes back at the second coming, the end of Babylon the city. And that will be when it's made so desolate that no one ever lives there again. And so, just one last thing I'd say today. That's my personal guess, because I couldn't really find a very good satisfactory answer for this. Why is many repeated twice? When it says many, many tickle you, parson, why is many repeated twice and the others are just said once? I think it's because you've been numbered. He's saying it twice. You've been numbered. You've been numbered. And so, like Babylon is fallen because it fell twice, Babylon is being counted twice. And so it was counted once when Belshazzar was king, and it'll be counted again when the Antichrist is ruling from it. Thank you guys for being here. And next week we'll do Daniel 6, Daniel and the Lion's Den.